In this lecture, you are going to learn about Reform Darwinism, grassroots progressives, progressive women, the National Women's Suffrage Association, the American Women's Suffrage Association, the Women Temperance Movement, settlement houses, birth control, and the Women's Trade Union League. The many problems associated with the Gilded Age, the rise of unprecedented fortunes and unprecedented poverty, controversies over imperialism, a new war between capital and labor, unsanitary food production, environmental destruction, and the outbreak of political radicalism confronted Americans. Terrible forces seemed out of control, and the nation seemed imperiled. Farmers and workers had been waging political war against capitalists and political conservatives for decades. But then slowly, toward the end of the 19th century, a new generation of middle-class Americans interjected themselves into public life and advocated new reforms to tame the runaway world of the Gilded Age. Widespread distraction with new trends in American society spurred the Progressive Era, named for the various progressive movements that attracted various constituencies around various reforms. Americans had many different ideas about how the country's development should be managed and whose interests required the greatest protection. During the Progressive Era, reformers sought to clean up politics, Black Americans continued their long struggle for civil rights, women demanded the vote with greater intensity, while also demanding a more equal role in society at large, and workers demanded higher wages, safer worker places, and the union recognition that will guarantee these rights. Whatever their goals, reform became the word of the age, and the sum of their efforts, whatever the ultimate impact or original intentions, gave the era its name. It is important to note that the active interventionist approach of the progressives directly challenged social Darwinism, the idea that the world operated on the principle of the survival of the fittest. Progressive sociologists argue that evolution could advance more rapidly if men and women used their intellects to alter the environment. This new theory, called Reform Darwinism, condemned the laissez-faire approach, insisting that the liberal state should play a more active role in solving social problems. Along with the ideology of Reform Darwinism, progressives believed in experts and efficiency. Progressives sought social justice, but they believed experts should be put in charge. From their point of view, experts were better equipped and the most able to handle all the ills of the Gilded Age. One of the main problems the progressives tried to fix was the ills plaguing the inner cities at the time. Progressives tackled the problems of the city with many approaches, including the settlement house movement, the social gospel, and the social purity movement. Progressive efforts to civilize the city demonstrated their willingness to take action and their belief in environment, not heredity alone. determine human behavior, and their optimism that conditions could be corrected through government action without radically altering America's economy or institutions. Religious groups were also very much involved in the progressive movement. Religious groups confronted the urban social problems by creating what they called a new social gospel. Its mission was to reform not only the individual, but also society. This ideology also counters social Darwinism and the gospel of Wald by saying riches do not signal divine favor. Those who followed the social gospel saw its mission as not simply to reform individuals, but also to reform society. Although the progressives tackled many different issues and they came from various backgrounds, there were various commonalities between the progressives. This includes the belief that environment, not heredity alone, determine human potential. Their sense of optimism that conditions could be corrected without radically altering America's economy or institutions. Their profound trust in experts and scientific investigations, and their willingness to take action. Women will be particularly involved in the progressive movement. Generations of women, and occasionally men, had pushed for women's suffrage for decades. Suffragettes' hard work resulted in slow but encouraging steps forward during the last decades of the 19th century. A great part of this movement forward was the creation of women clubs that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th century. In the 1890s, women formed national women club federations. The formation of these clubs was particularly significant in campaigns for suffrage and women's rights. These clubs will give women leadership roles and experience in politics. Thus, women's suffrage was typically intertwined with a wide range of reform efforts. Many suffragists argued that women's votes were necessary to clean up politics and combat social evils. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were better reformers who advocated, among other things, better working conditions for labor, married women's property rights, liberation of divorce laws, and women's admission into colleges and trade schools. Their passion for other causes led some conservatives to oppose women's political rights because it equated the suffragists' cause with radicalism in general. Despite their opponents, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony led the National Women's Suffrage Association, founded in 1869. The NWSAA was one of the first independent women's rights organizations in the United States. The NWSA was set to enact change at the national level. Following their founders' beliefs, the NWSA fought for a variety of causes, including better working conditions for labor, women's suffrage, married women's property rights, liberation of divorce laws, and women's admission into colleges and trade schools. Another organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, believed success could be more easily achieved through state-by-state campaigns. The AWSA was primarily concerned with women's suffrage and did not campaign on other issues. They also were in favor of the 15th Amendment, arguing that it was a step forward and that adding women to the issue would in fact hurt their efforts to pass the 15th Amendment. However, despite their differences between the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, they united forces and created the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. In 1890, the NAWSA pursued state-level campaigns to gain the vote for women. With success in Idaho, Colorado, and Utah, women's suffrage had become more accepted by the 1890s. By 1911, 6 Western states had passed suffrage amendments to their constitutions. Determined to win the vote, the National American Suffrage Association developed a dual strategy that focused on the passage of state voting right laws and on the ratification of an amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Meanwhile, a new, more militant suffrage organization emerged on the scene. Led by Alice Paul, the National Women's Party took the streets to demand voting rights, organizing marches and protests that mobilized thousands of women. Beginning in January of 1917, National Women's Party members also began to picket the White House, an action that led to the arrest and imprisonment of over 115 women. It will not be until after World War I that women will finally get the right to vote in the United States with the passing of the 19th Amendment. Ministers also play an active role in the social purity movement, attacking vices such as prostitution and alcoholism. One of the most known organizations for temperance during the Progressive Era was the Women's Temperance Movement, the WCTU. The WTCU was among one of the largest political organizations in the 19th century, with 150,000 adult members. The National American Women's Suffrage Association had 13,000. The WCTU was founded in 1874 as a modest temperance organization devoted to combating the evils of drunkenness. Its initial decentralized structure allowed groups to tailor their activities to local needs. Women who joined the WCTU found a source of friendship as well as political activism. although it began at the local grassroots level from 1879 to 1898, Francis Willard invigorated the organization by transforming it into a national political organization. Embracing a do-everything policy that adopted any and all reasonable reforms that will improve social welfare and advance women's rights. By the 1890s, Willard was treating drunkenness as a public health issue rather than a personal sin, a social problem rather than an individual failure. Temperance advocates supported reforms designed to relieve poverty, improve public health, raise literacy, alleviate the conditions of workers, reform prisons, suppress public immorality, and preserve peace. Willard and her associates gave speeches, wrote articles, published books and newspaper columns on the evils of drink, organized petition campaigns, and lobbied office holders. The WTCU also endorsed women's suffrage and formed an alliance with the country's largest labor union. Willard also supported laws restricting the workday to 8 hours and prohibiting childhood labor. However, despite the numerous agendas, temperance and then the full prohibition of alcohol always loomed large among the organization. Attacks on alcohol went hand in hand with the push for social purity, and not surprisingly, the temperance campaign heated up in the early 20th century. Many American reformers associated alcohol with nearly every social ill. Alcohol was blamed for domestic abuse, poverty, crime, and disease. The 1912 Anti-Saloon Yearbook, for instance, presented charts indicating comparable increases in alcohol consumption alongside rising divorce rates. The WCTU called alcohol a homewrecker. More insidiously, perhaps, reformers also associated alcohol with cities and immigrants, blaming alcoholism on Catholics and the working classes. Still, reformers believed that the abolition of strong drink will bring about social progress, decrease the need for prisons and insane asylums, save women and children from domestic abuse, and usher in a more just, progressive society. The issue of prostitution and sex trafficking was yet another issue progressives tackled in their efforts to purify and save the city. Religious groups became very active in the crusade against white slavery. With the growth of large cities, prostitution was a major cause of concern in the progressive era. Though the number of prostitutes per capita in the United States was probably declining in 1900, the presence of red light districts was obvious. Thousands of young women, as well as a smaller number of young men, were exploited in this sex trade. This image appeared in the Great War on White Slavery, published by the American Purity Foundation in 1911. It illustrates how immigrant women could be entangled in the sex trade by alleged friends who offer them work. Another example of the purity campaign is the silent movie Traffic of Souls. The movie clearly displayed the danger of young girls being persuaded to become prostitutes. The social purity movement brought awareness to the issue of white slavery, but it quickly spread to other sex-related issues that these groups found immoral, such as sexual segregation prisons, opposing contraception, and censoring pornography. The issue of banning contraception was particularly problematic. In a society where women had little rights and had to often perform what was known as their womanly duties to please their husbands, unwanted pregnancies were commonplace. And working-class women were perhaps among the most in need of birth control, often having numerous children that many could not feed. Just take a look at the line outside at one of the first birth control clinics in New York City. As you can see, most of these women already have at least one infant child. Among some of the most known pioneers of the call for birth control was Margaret Sanger. Sanger was an American birth control activist, sex educator, writer, and nurse. Sanger and her followers saw birth control not only as a sexual and medical reform, but also as means to alter social and political power relationships and to alleviate human misery. Sanger coined the term birth control and opened the first birth control clinic in the United States and established organizations that evolved into the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Sanger used her writings and speeches primarily to promote her way of thinking. Birth control became linked with freedom of speech when Margaret Sanger's militant feminist journal, The Woman's Rebel, was confiscated by the post office for violating social purity laws. Facing arrest, Sanger fled to Europe. When charges were dropped under public pressure, Sanger returned to the United States and turned to direct action, opening the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. Sanger's efforts contributed to several judicial cases that helped legalize contraception in the United States. In 1921, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, which later became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. In New York City, she organized the first birth control clinic, staffed by all-female doctors, as well as a clinic in Harlem with an all-African American advisory council, where African American staffs were later added. In 1929, she formed the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control, which served as the focal point of her lobbying efforts to legalize contraception in the United States. From 1952 to 1959, Sanger served as president of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Although Sanger has often been seen as a controversial figure for her support in eugenics, her efforts to legalize birth control and making it universally available for women is part of the legacy of the progressive movement. On the other hand, the fact that birth control and women's reproductive rights is still a controversial issue today shows the gender barriers and limitations of the progressives and their reforms. Women were also very active in the efforts to reform the city. The settlement house movement, which began in England, came to the United States in 1886 with the opening of the University Settlement House in New York City. Settlement houses in which volunteer middle-class settlement workers would live, hoping to share knowledge and culture with and alleviate the poverty of their low-income neighbors, became very popular during the Progressive Era. During the Progressive Era, the number of settlement houses grew from 6 in 1891 to more than 400 by 1911. The movement also evolved during this time period, and many settlement houses became areas that provided educational, recreational, and other social services to the community. Women, particularly college-educated women like Jane Addams and Liliam Wald, formed the backbone of the settlement house movement and stood in the forefront of the progressive movement. Reformers like Jane Addams and Lilian Wald believed that only by living among the poor could they help bridge the growing class divide. Born in Centerville, Illinois in 1860, Addams lost her mother by age 2 and lived under the attentive care of her father. At 17, she left home to attend Rockford Female Seminary. An idealist, Addams sought the means to make the world a better place. She believed that well-educated women of means, such as herself, lacked practical strategies for engaging everyday reform. After 4 years at Rockford, Addams embarked on a multi-year grand tour of Europe. She found herself drawn to English settlement houses, a kind of prototype for social work in which philanthropists embedded themselves among communities and offered services to disadvantaged populations. After visiting London's Theobald Hall in 1887, Addams returned to the United States and in 1889 founded Hull House in Chicago with her longtime confidant and companion, Ellen Gates Starr. Hull House workers provided for their neighbors by running a nursery and a kindergarten, administering classes for parents and clubs for children, and organizing social and cultural events for the community. Reformer Florence Kelly, who stayed at Hull House from 1891 to 1899, convinced Addams to move into the realm of social reform. Hull House then began exposing conditions in local sweatshops and advocating for the organization of workers. Addams often called the conditions caused by urban poverty and industrialization a social crime. Hull House workers surveyed their community and produced statistics on poverty, disease, and living conditions. Together, Kelly and Addams petitioned legislators to pass anti-sweatshop legislations that limited the hours of work for women and children to 8 per day. Yet Addams was an upper-class white Protestant woman who, like many reformers, refused to embrace more radical policies. While Addams called labor organizing a social obligation, she also warned the labor movement against constant temptation towards class warfare. Addams, like many reformers, favored cooperation between rich and poor, and bosses and workers, whether cooperation was a realistic possibility or not. With her efforts, Addams became kind of a celebrity. In 1912, she became the first woman to give a nominating speech at a major party convention when she seconded the nomination of Theodore Roosevelt as the Progressive Party's candidate for president. Her campaigns for social reform and women's rights won headlines, and her voice became ubiquitous in progressive politics. Addams' advocacy grew beyond domestic concerns. Beginning with her work in the Anti-Imperialist League during the Spanish-American War, Addams increasingly began to see militarism as a drain on resources better spent on social reform. In 1907, she wrote Newer Ideals of Peace, a book that will become, for many, a philosophical foundation of pacifism. Addams emerged as a prominent opponent of America's entry into World War I. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Day-to-day contact with neighbors made settlement house workers particularly sympathetic to labor unions. Attempts to forge a cross-class alliance became institutionalized in 1903 with the creation of the Women's Trade Union League, the WTUL. The Women's Trade Union League, WTUL, brought together women workers and middle-class allies, and its goal was to organize working women into unions under the auspices of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Increasingly, the WTUL turned its effort to lobbying for protective legislation laws that would limit hours and regulate women's working conditions. Advocates of protective legislation won a major victory in 1908 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Mueller v. Oregon to uphold an Oregon law that limited the hours women could work to 10 a day. Another notable success for the WTUL came in 1909 with the uprising of 20,000, a strike of women employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City to protest low wages, dangerous working conditions, and management's refusal to organize the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. By the time the strike ended, the WTUL had contributed greatly to the effort. The workers had won some important demands and achieved a remarkable solidarity. However, despite the demonstration of solidarity and the uprising of 20,000 workers, the strike failed to change the dangerous conditions facing women workers, who continued to work in horrific conditions. Two years later, in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Manhattan caught fire. The doors of the factory had been chained shut to prevent employees from taking unauthorized breaks. The managers who held the keys saved themselves but left over 200 women behind. The rickety fire ladder on the side of the building collapsed immediately after the fire began. Women lined the rooftop and windows of the 10-story building and jumped to their deaths. Life nets held by firemen tore at the impact of the falling bodies. Among the onlookers, women were hysterical, scores fainted, men wept. They hurled themselves against the police lines. By the time the fire burned itself out, 71 workers were injured and 146 had died. After the fire, reporter Bill Shepard reflected, "I look up on the heap of dead bodies, and I remember these girls were shirtwaist makers. I remember the great strike last year, in which the same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were the answer." After the fire, Triangle owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris were brought up on manslaughter charges. They were acquitted after less than 2 hours of deliberation. The outcome continued a trend in the industrializing economy that saw workers' deaths answered with little punishment of the business owners responsible for such dangerous conditions. But the fight for better working conditions and reform will continue as such tragedies mounted and working and living conditions worsened, inequality grew. It became increasingly difficult to develop justification for this new modern order. As you can see, when it pertains to women progressives and the different causes these women were fighting for, the progressive era had mixed results. In one hand, the progressive era brought attention to issues that affected women and their fight for equality. Some women fought for better pay, better working conditions, and suffrage in efforts to better their lives. But women will not get the right to vote till the 20th century, and many of the original suffragettes will not get to vote in their lifetime. Moreover, some will argue that equality in the workplace is still a work in progress, and that in many industries today, women get paid less than their male colleagues for doing the same job and having the same skills. On the other hand, women reformers were able to find better success when it pertains to public health, such as the temperance society and the settlement house movement. The temperance movement will eventually lead to prohibition, and the settlement house movement will eventually lead to the creation of social work as a profession and various other initiatives. The success of these other reform movements can perhaps be associated with the gender roles of the time. The temperance movement and the settlement house movement were successful women-led movements because society viewed them as issues pertaining to the domestic sphere. Thus, they were able to gain far more support and less opposition than women obtaining better working conditions and the right to vote. That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn more.